In this section, we're going to create textures for the walls, planks, and the plywood. We're going to create a high poly mesh for sheet metal normal map, and we're going to create the sheet metal textures. So first I'm going to start by adding a new image with the dimensions 2048 by 1024. And now we're going to open up a couple textures to use. So in the text lib folder, I'm going to navigate to the stone walls folder, and we're going to select a few images from there. We're going to end up using both orange wall and pink wall, but I start off by opening pink wall and wall 1. When I go to create a real grungy texture, it's just a matter of different photos and what I can use from each one to mix them together well to get a desired result. So from pink wall, I just selected that light area of concrete. I'm going to go through right now with the clone brush. I'm going to get rid of all the unique details. Since this is going to be a repeating texture, we don't want anything to give away that it's actually tiling. So markers like light patches or dark patches or graffiti, I'm going to get rid of all of them. I'm going to fill in that area at the bottom. That patch of dirt in the middle, I'm going to keep that, since that's going to be tiling basically where the windows are. It's going to be hard to tell that it's tiling. I'm going to select all that and copy it. I'm going to shrink it down to fit into our main file. I'm going to duplicate it and move it to the right so that it spans the whole width. Now there's a big old seam in the middle, so I'm going to go through with the clone brush and fix that. Now what I'm doing is going through with the clone brush, and I'm trying to create some unique details on the right side. Since we have a wide texture, there's really no need for us to be tiling within the texture. So I'm making sure that the right side looks different than the left so we can have extra detail. So I end up not using wall 1. Now I'm going to go and open up orange wall. And this is going to be most of our main detail, especially dirt for the top and bottom of the wall. It's a bit slanted, so I'm going to go through with the clone brush. And again, I'm going to get rid of some of the unique details. And I'm going to even out the dirt at the top and the bottom. Well, at the left and the right now, but I end up rotating this. So I copy that and I paste it into our main file. I'm going to shrink it into place. I noticed there was a little bit of an area on the left side that I forgot to go through with the clone brush with. So I'm just fixing that up now. And I'm copying and pasting it again, fitting it into frame. And I moved it over to the point where it was overlapping. That way, instead of using the clone brush, I could just use the eraser to get rid of the seam. I joined that layer together, and now I'm going through with different blending modes. Just experimenting. I usually end up on either multiply or soft light or hard light. I opened up the warehouse image just to get an idea of what the wall looks like in the photograph, so I can use it as reference. I ended up putting the bottom layer on top of the new orange wall layer, and now I'm just experimenting with different blending modes again. And now I'm experimenting with the different levels. So it seems to work pretty good with blending mode multiply, and with the levels adjusted a bit to make the contrast more extreme. I'm going to go into the metal rust folder. I'm going to open up rust 6. Well, it looks like I changed my mind. I'm going to go into the stone cement folder. I'm going to add a little bit more grungy of a texture. So open up Cement 2, Clean Concrete, and Dirt Gray. Not sure which ones I'm going to use. So I copied a piece from there. I'm going to throw that in. I'm going to experiment with blending modes again after I get rid of some of the details. I just want this to give me a little bit extra dirt. That's why I changed the levels to make it really bright. But I ended up deleting that layer. Now I used a portion from Cement 2. I'm going to duplicate that around this image. I'm going to get rid of the seams and the details, and then I'm going to again experiment with the blending modes. And that's basically all creating a grunge texture is. Just get a lot of interesting photos with a lot of dirty details, put them over top of each other, mess with the levels, mess with the blending modes, until you get something that looks good. So there I put it on a soft light blending mode. Gave me a little extra detail. It's starting to look like something now. I'm going to open up Rust 6 from the Metal Rust folder. This is going to give me some good rust dripping down effect. I'm going to use the clone brush to get rid of all the details at the bottom, because we just want the dirt to be dripping down from the top. We don't need too much detail in this wall texture. It's already pretty grungy. I switched it to soft light. I'm going to blur it a little bit just to see what that looks like. Then mess with the levels where it all kind of looks like crap, so I undo that. Use the eraser with low opacity to get rid of some of the details dripping down. I just want this to add a little bit of a dirt effect. I'm going to bring the saturation down, because I don't need that red color that it had. I'm going to desaturate the orange wall layer as well. So now with the top layer, I'm messing with the opacity. I got it down to about 50%. Now in the stone cement folder, I opened up stained.jpg. I messed with the levels so I could get a real nice contrasting look to it. And I put it on blending mode linear burn and down to a fill opacity of about 33%. And I desaturated it. And now I put it on multiply blending mode and I lowered the opacity even more. Back to linear burn and down to 16%. And I think that's where I keep it. Now I'm just messing with the opacity of different layers until I get something I'm looking for. I'm making things visible and invisible to see which layers I want to keep, which ones look good, which ones add enough to the scene to keep. To the texture to keep. It's just a lot of different experimentation with different photographs. I save that as wall.cal.psd. I think it looks good enough to check out in Blender. So I'm going to save that as a PNG named wall.cal.png. Now I work with PNGs in the beginning, just so towards the end I know how much I need to compress things. But I don't want to start off with a compressed image like a JPEG and end up being able to fit a little extra detail or a higher file size or a file with higher dimensions. So I just work with uncompressed PNGs in the beginning. Then I convert everything later if I need to. But I rarely ever run into any problems with using JPEGs from the beginning. I just like working with PNGs because I like that crisp, clean, sharp detail. Now I'm unwrapping the walls. It's pretty self-explanatory. I'm just projecting from view, whether front view or side view. And in the side panel there, I just enabled textured solid so I can get a quick preview of how these textures look applied. Now the dirt at the top and the bottom of the texture, you can see I have at the top and the bottom of the wall. Obviously, it's the way it's supposed to work. Here I just wasn't sure which part of the UV was the top and which part was the bottom, so I was rotating around, trying to come to a conclusion. I just decided to re-unwrap it by projecting from view from the side. That's another benefit of the cross planks as well, especially on the back walls. Because on the back walls the texture needs to repeat vertically, we have those cross planks to cover the seam, so you can't tell that it's tiling. Now we have to actually make it tile, so I'm going through one layer at a time, I'm hiding the other layers, and I'm using the offset tool from the filter menu. I'm offsetting it horizontally by 1024, and then I'm just going to go through with the clone brush and fix that seam in the center. I'm going to do that for each layer. On some of the layers I have to switch back to normal mode so I can see exactly what I'm dealing with and what I'm painting on. Doing more experimentation here with blending modes. And I think I deleted a layer because it wasn't really adding enough. But it didn't make a significant change either way. When you're going through creating textures, don't just experiment with things like levels and blending modes, but also layer arrangement. Because one layer on top of another might look better than if it was underneath. And all of these PSDs are included on the DVD, so you can go through and check my final layering and my final blending modes. Because it is all really about experimentation. I don't know what the texture is going to look like when I first start it. I have an idea of what I want, and I have an idea of what kind of textures to use. I usually end up using concrete textures and rust textures to create something like a wall, and some stain textures or grunge textures. So in the stone walls folder, I'm going to open up wall dirty and see if we can get some details out of this image. Just going to select a section there. I duplicated it so it spanned the width. I'm getting rid of the seam in the center. So now that I added some extra detail at the top, some extra dirt, I saved that image and I'm going to reload it in Blender. Now it's looking a little bit better, but we're still going to work on that some later. I'm going to sharpen up the bottom layer and the layer above that. I'm going to create a new file, 1024 by 1024. Back into the text lib folder. I'm going to go into wood, planks, beams. We're going to select a couple of samples here to work with, including pallet, which is spelled wrong, pole 3, and splintery, and pole 1. I'm just going to straight up steal these planks right off this pallet. I'm going to squish them down into this 1024 by 1024 space. To just move one of the corners like that, you can hold the control key while you left click on it. And that way you can skew it. Use the trim tool right there just to make sure that this plank stayed within the bounds of the image. That way when we do something like offset it, it's going to offset perfectly. And if you have an image that extends outside the bounds of what you can see, and you go to use the offset tool, you'll notice what I'm talking about when it causes a problem. Now the trim tool trims everything outside of the bounds of your selection, so if you select the entire image, it's going to trim everything outside of the bounds of the image. So I got rid of the seam after offsetting, and then I added a sharpen filter. I'm going to go back to the palette image, steal another plank. I'm going to again trim the edges so that it doesn't extend outside the image. Then offset it. I paint over some of the nails as well. Since these are going to be repeating, we don't want too many unique details, just like when we were making the wall. I go through and steal another palette, plank, and I think I steal one more of those. I take a sample from the splintering image. So I'm going to use this to create a different set of planks. This one I believe is for the window frames. I'm going to take a sample from that telephone pole. And yet again create a different set of planks. I end up deleting that one. Now I'm going to open up plank wall and steal some planks from that for use for the windows. So I have plank wall and planks 1 and plank 7 selected. Let's see what we can draw from these. The end goal here is just to have a few different samples of planks and a few different planks of each sample on the same texture map so that we can use it for all the planks in our scene and the pillars as well. Now this is kind of a low-res image that I'm stealing planks from, and I don't even end up using this section of the texture map when we go to texture things. This section at the bottom I think I end up using for those vertical supports we created for the fencing. I'm going to save this down to the textures folder. It's planks col.psd. I'm going to change the hue with colorize enabled to a nice brown, a very desaturated brown. I duplicated the layer on top of itself just to see if I could play with blending modes and have it mixed together well. In the stone walls folder, I'm going to open up orange wall again. End up closing that. There it is again. I'm going to select a portion of that just to see if I can add some extra detail to some of these planks and some coloring. Here I'm blurring it a little bit just because I don't want the detail of the wall. I basically just want variations in coloring. So I stick that in multiply mode and mess with the opacity. And now, since this file has quite a few samples of wood in it, I'm creating different folders to kind of organize things in case I need to come back and work with things later. That one layer I duplicated twice and moved over the top planks. I'm going to make sure that tiles, and I'm going to see if I can use a good blending mode to put on top of those planks. I end up not trying that. Again, I'm making sure that all of my layers tile correctly by offsetting them and then fixing the seam. I'm opening up the reference image again just to see what all the planks and pillars look like in the photograph. Ours are going to be a little bit different, but that's basically what I'm using for the foundation of my ideas for how I want each texture to look. In wood planks and beams, I'm going to open up plank wall again. I'm going to paste a new plank in to replace one of the other ones, which I didn't feel had enough detail. A different opacity brush when using the clone tool can help with the blending. I'm going to save that as a PNG. We're going to load it into the planks and see how everything looks together. So I went into edit mode in one of the large groups on the back wall. Now I have to rotate these pillar UVs so that they're horizontal. Now I get to go through and move all these UVs over to a sample of plank that actually looks good on them. We have several to choose from. All you have to do to apply the image to the UVs is to go into edit mode in one of the objects that are already unwrapped and load the image in the image window. Simple as that. So I rotated them 90 degrees And for the pillars, I'm going to choose the real splintery wood in the center. I'm using the L key to select random plank UVs, so that I can move them to different sections of the texture so they can have different wooden plank textures. Now I'm making sure all the scaling is correct. I'm trying to make use of these white painted planks. I end up not working, I just use the splinter texture for the window frames. And it works out good, but we waste a little bit of texture space. One of the problems I made is that when I'm randomizing the textures here by moving each island of UVs to different plank textures, I forget to keep each side of each plank together. So in the end I end up with a plank that might have 3 different plank textures on it, one on each different side of it, which makes a problem, but it's nothing more than tedious to fix. As you can see, as I'm rotating around, the underside of some of these things have different textures. So I just have to go through and select those faces, move those UVs to the same plank texture as the side faces have, and that's that. So it creates a little extra work. I should have fixed that. I should have had that in mind since the beginning, but it's no big deal. So I'm just going through now, I'm pressing L on those faces on the bottom to select that strip of faces, moving it to the right plank texture so everything's consistent, and that's that. So it's not so important for the side planks, but for these center planks here, you can see that each side of it might have a different texture. So we not only have to worry about the underside of the plank, but also we have to make sure that each side of the plank has the same texture as well. So here I go again, making sure each side of the plank is consistent and shows the same texture. I would say normally you wouldn't have to worry about the top side of these things, but if you think there's even a slight chance that there might be a camera view from the top looking down on your scene, then just go through and fix it. It's only going to take a second. That's also something to keep in mind for optimization. there might be a lot of faces in the scene that aren't going to be seen, so you might as well delete them. I'm going through with the trusses, and instead of randomizing all of the UVs by selecting everything and then moving individual faces and groups of faces, or UVs I mean, I'm going through and I'm selecting random plank meshes entirely so that I can just play with certain UVs here and there, and it'll just help me randomize things a lot more easier and a lot more efficiently. So again, I'm selecting just groups of planks, and then I'm playing with their UVs. I'm moving them around, randomizing them, putting them on different plank textures, and then I'm going to hide those meshes or those vertices that I have selected, and I'm going to go through and select a new group of planks and do the same thing. The reason I'm selecting the meshes is that because I have 4 different samples of wood that I want to use for these truss planks, I want to make sure that I don't end up with those with having different faces having different plank textures on them, like on all the other planks we just fixed. And also it makes it easier to randomize which plank has which texture if I can go through and actually visually select each plank that I want to have a different texture. Because it would suck here if I forgot that we screwed up on the faces earlier, because there are a lot of faces here that we would have had to have fixed. So this way I ensure that each plank has a single texture on each side of it. Now I'm moving all the fence objects into one layer so I can work with these. On these vertical planks, some of the faces weren't facing the correct way, so I'm just going through selecting those faces and flipping the normals by pressing the W key for the special menu and selecting Flip Normals. I'm back in Photoshop. I'm going to create a new file at 1024 by 1024. Because I'm OCD, I hate gray backgrounds, so I always got to start off with a white one. I'm going to go into the Wood Sheets folder. We're going to make a good plywood texture now. I'm going to select Old Ply 1. I'm going to paste that into our main file. Offset it, get rid of the seam. And I'm going to get rid of some of the details. I'm going to offset it vertically as well, just because I don't know if I'm going to be having this repeat both horizontally and vertically on the things that I texture it to. So to cover all my bases, I make it repeatable on any axis. Added a sharpen filter, now I'm going to play with the levels a little bit. I'm going to save that as roofcal.png or roofplycal.png. Just getting rid of a few more details there. That big white roof is now going to be filled with a bunch of plywood. From top view, I just selected Project from View in the UV Unwrap menu, which is the U key. And now we have a tiling plywood texture on our roof. To further hide the tiling, I can select sections of faces on the roof between the slats and move those UVs so that it displays the texture in a different way. So that all of those knots in the plywood texture don't align perfectly all the way down the line. So that's just another little technique that helps hide the tiling. I'm also rotating some of the UVs by 90 degrees. I had a little bit of texture stretching, so I'm fixing that now. Now we're going to texture these these boards of plywood over the holes in the roof with the same texture. I'm going to adjust the levels to make things a little bit darker and a tiny bit less saturated. That ends up a bit dark. I'm going to go back and undo that and play with the levels again, but make things a little less extreme. And there were too many knots on the plywood, so I'm going to go through with the clone brush and get rid of a few. And that looks a lot better. I'm going to scale the UVs up. Now that we got rid of a lot of those knots, the tiling isn't so noticeable. I'm going to open up wall-call.psd. We're going to make some changes to that. I'm going to open up metal flat and select dirty metal 1. Just felt like the wall needed some more detail, a little bit extra dirt. I read somewhere that if you don't have 6 layers of dirt on a grunge texture, then you don't have enough. I'm experimenting with the arrangement of layers and the blending modes again. I have that new layer we just made. I have that at the bottom of the stack now. I went up into the variations options just to give it a different color, a more orange color, so it can match the rest of the color scheme. And again, playing with more blending modes. So I got it on the top or in the middle of the stack now. We'll multiply. I changed the saturation and the levels. And now I've got it on normal at 11%. 11% opacity. So I'm going to save that as wall-call.png and see how it looks. Definitely looks better. Before it was a little bit too saturated, there was too much orange and not enough dirt and detail. So that one extra layer added just the right amount of extra detail. This is wall-call.png I'm working with. This is the final image. I just decided to try to play with the levels on that to see if I can make things look better real quick. So I play with the desaturation. Now I went off on a tangent to kind of fix the UVs on these planks for the fencing. Some of the areas are stretched out. Now we're going to work with the sheet metal. Now I just duplicated this and hid the other one so that I can straighten this out. We're going to create a high poly sheet metal so we can get those nice wavy lines in it and use it for a normal map. I'm going to press set smooth on that. That's important for when we're baking the normal map later. And I'm going to add a modifier, a subsurf modifier. In front view, I'm going to use Ctrl+R to add a few loop cuts. I'm going to move those edges to the end there, because subsurf tends to taper things off unless you have edges close together. Now I press Shift D to make a duplicate of this. We're going to need a low poly object, so I deleted the modifier there. We're going to bake the high poly object normal map onto the low poly object. And here I'm scaling down the mesh of the low poly object just a little bit to act as a margin for when we're baking. I'm going to go into edit mode into the low poly object and add a new image, 1024 by 1024. And I'm going to scale this up and I'm going to stretch it to the bounds of the top half of this image. And now with both of these objects selected in bake mode, in the render options, I'm going to change bake mode to normals, margin to 4, and normal space to tangent. I'm going to enable selected to active. Selected to active means you first want to select the high poly object, that's the selected one. Hold shift and then select the low poly object, which is the active one. And that's going to bake the high poly normal map onto the low poly object. Now I opened up sheetmetalnor.png. I'm duplicating the normal map at the top. I'm moving it down because we're going to have two samples of sheet metal textures. And they're both going to have different normal maps. So we're going to use this whole 1024 by 1024 space to create two samples of sheet metal. Now I'm going to navigate to the metal corrugated folder and open up corrugatedstyle.jpg. I offset it horizontally and vertically and fix the seams. Now we're going to pull this into our sheet metal nor.png file, which we're going to end up saving as a different name so that we can work with it as a color map. And then we'll switch back and forth from the color map to the normal map. Just creating some variation to the texture at the bottom. Since it's the same as the top, I'm just going to go through with the clone brush. Put a few blots here and there, just to make it look a little bit different. I'm going to navigate to now the metal flat folder. I'm going to open up old dirty scraped.jpg. We're going to use this for one of our samples of sheet metal textures. I put that on hard light blending mode, and so far it looks pretty good. I just saved it as sheetmetalcal.psd. Creating a new light just so I can get a good visual of this one sheet of metal. Added a new material. I'm going to rename it to sheet metal. Crank the intensity up to 1. And in the textures window, there's already a default texture there. I'm going to rename it to sheet metal cal. I'm going to go back into Photoshop. I'm going to save this PSD as sheetmetalcal.png. And back in Blender, I'm going to change the texture type to image or movie. I'm going to open up that color map we just created for the sheet metal. Actually, first I open up the normal map accidentally. I had to press that refresh button because Blender got stuck showing the normal map. For some reason the data block name still reads sheet metal nor, so I just went through and I changed that real quick to sheet metal cal. It was just a stupid little detail I noticed. You don't really have to worry about things like that. I'm going to set smooth that piece of sheet metal. Looks like crap now, but once we have the normal map, it's going to start looking sweet. That's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to go into a new texture channel. I'm going to rename that to sheet metal nor. Change the texture type to image. And then we're going to load in the sheet metal nor.png. I'm going to change the coordinates to UV. Now I'm looking for the normal map options. I took influence off of diffuse, put that down to 0, and I enabled the nor option. I cranked that up to 1. And in image sampling, I enabled normal map. I made sure that the normal map space was tangent. And there we have our sweet wavy piece of metal. Then we have to fix the UVs for this thing. So just scale it up and then stretch it to match. That new light I created, I moved to every layer, so it would affect everything in every layer. Although I think it would have anyway, unless the layer option was enabled in the light options. I still just made sure to put it in every layer. I'm selecting every piece of sheet metal in the scene. I'm going to go to local view, I think. I'm going to work with all of these alone. Actually, I selected all of them, and then finally I selected that one piece of sheet metal we created the material to, and then I pressed Ctrl+J to join them. That way, every mesh that I joined to that mesh that had a material inherited that material. So now every piece of sheet metal has its own texture and material. I saved that sheet metal NOR texture we were working on so that I could reload that in the Blender. You can go into the Metal Rust folder. I'm going to open up rust6.png. I'm going to select a portion of that, and we're going to work on the top piece of sheet metal now, just creating some dirt and rust and grunge. If you saw the gap in between those textures at the top when I went to go offset it, that's because I didn't trim the image first. So I did a quick trim by selecting the entire canvas, going up into the edit buttons and selecting trim. Then I did an offset, and then I fixed the seam. Add a little sharpen filter. Now I'm going to play with the blending modes. I've got it on multiply, and I'm going to play with the levels a little bit. Go back into the Metal Rust folder. I'm going to open up Rusty Container. I'm going to take a sample from that. I'm going to put this on the bottom piece of sheet metal. I have it on soft light blending mode. I save that, and I'm going to go back and save it as a PNG now. Sheet metal kyle.png again. I'm going to open that in the image window, and I'm going to press reload. So now we have a bunch of nicely stained and dirty sheets of metal. I'm just filling that space in between with the texture from the top piece of sheet metal, because I was sick of looking at that blue. And again, it acts like a margin. If some of the UVs were to have strayed outside of that quadrant that had the sheet metal texture and into the blue, that would have showed up on the texture in the game. So now I'm going to start converting this color map into a normal map that we can mix with our normal map we made from the high poly sheet metal. I'm going to start one layer at a time, so I'm going to start with the base layer, the base corrugated metal texture. I'm going to go and choose the NVIDIA Normal Map filter from the Filters menu. Have it in 3x3 and scale of 10, and it creates something like this. If you choose Blending Mode Overlay, and then I'm going to play with the fill percentage. I put the fill percent to about 10, and I'm going to go through the same process with each of the layers. There I duplicated this layer, and I created two different conversions for the normal map. One on a 3x3 sample and one on a 7x7 sample. The 3x3 sample is going to give us sharper details for our normal map, while the 7x7 sample is going to make everything bump out more. So it's a good technique to mix these two together to get a really decent normal map. And like any texture I convert to a normal map using Photoshop, I make sure to go into the Channels tab and select the red channel and invert those colors by pressing Ctrl+I. And now I'm mixing these layers down by using the Blending Mode Overlay, and also playing with the opacity on layers where I think the normal map is too extreme. I'm putting everything in folders just to organize things. We're going to do the same process with the top. Now, just like before, I'm going to create a duplicate of that layer. I'm going to create two different normal map conversions for it, using 3x3 or 7x7. You can also use 4 sample. It's a little less sharp than 3x3, which might be better for images that have a lot of sharp detail in it. Now I reloaded the normal map, and I forgot to change one of the red channels, so I went back and I fixed that. I inverted the red channel and then I brought it back into Blender. Now some of the details are a little bit too extreme, they're bumped out a little bit too much, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to play with the fill percentages. It doesn't matter if you change the fill percent or the opacity percent, it's basically the same thing, unless you have layer styles on. So I'm going to open back up sheetmetalcol.psd. I'm going to rename it to sheetmetalspec. Actually, not rename, I'm going to save a copy of it as sheetmetalspec. Now we're going to create the specular map. And this is basically a simple process of just going through desaturating everything, and then playing with the levels until you get a good level you want for the shininess that you are trying to achieve. And I'm going to go through layer by layer, desaturate it, play with the levels. And I'm going to keep my wits about me. If I see a part of an image that is either rusty or dirty, that part is clearly going to be black or very, very dark, because there's not going to be a whole lot of specularity there. So this layer I'm working with now is going to be nice and dark like that. So there's going to be no shine whatsoever. Sometimes you might have to invert the colors in order to get the shininess that you want. Sometimes you might even actually have to paint a little bit to make sure that some areas don't shine or some areas shine more. So I created a new texture, I named it Sheet Metal Spec, and I loaded in the Sheet Metal Spec image, changed the coordinates to UV, turned intensity off for diffuse, and now I turn intensity on for specular. Now I'm playing to see which one looks better, intensity or color, in the specular panel. I have them both enabled right now at value 1. And I just turned on hardness at value 1. I think I have specularity still turned on to about 0.5 in the material settings. So that's what's confusing me right now, because I'm wondering why there's a little bit extra shine when there shouldn't be. So in the text lib folder, we're going to finish off this color map by adding a couple of nuts and bolts. And I go into the metal miscellaneous folder and open up riveted, figuring I'd steal a rivet instead of painting one myself because I'm really lazy when it comes to texturing. But this rivet doesn't work that great. I end up going and stealing a bolt from one of the fences. But basically I just erase around it, I duplicate it everywhere, and blend it nice and good into the texture by using a blending mode like multiply. And then I add it to the normal map in the end, and we end up with a finished color map. It's not really noticeable in color map, so I decided to drop a shadow. Adding these stupid little rivets took way longer than it should. Now I go back in the metal miscellaneous folder and open up roofmolded1.jpg. I steal one of these bolts. I just put it over the top of the bolts I just laid down. It's a lot of work for a stupid little detail, but it actually does add something to the final texture, especially when we add the normal map for it. I'm going to quick save that as the color map. I'm going to reload it in Blender and see how it looks on the sheet metal. Looks pretty good, but it's out of place. We want it to be where the sheet waves down and inward. We don't want these bolts to be sticking out on top. So I moved it down a bit. Now I'm painting a little bit in these three corners. Really only need to paint in two corners. That way I can copy that whole layer and paste into place in another image. Unfortunately, Photoshop CS2 does not have a paste into place option that I know of anyway. So that's just a quick workaround for that. If you paint in the top left corner and the bottom right corner in the layer that you want to copy, you can then copy that entire layer and paste into place in an image that's the same size. So I'm converting that to a normal map, choosing overlay blend mode, and I'm going into the channels tab and inverting the red channel. And now I'm going to paste that layer into the specular map. I'm dropping a shadow on the specular map just to kind of make these pop by not having any shine directly around them. That way they'll be easier to spot when the light's shining just right. I'm going to reload each of the images from the texture window. I'm going to duplicate those bolts and move them up so that the other piece of sheet metal has them too. I'm going to make sure I have them positioned correctly, kind of right above the purple and on the light blue. That way they appear where I want them to appear on the sheet metal. I'm going to drop a shadow to make them pop a little bit more. I'm going to go through the same process and make sure that these bolts are in the normal map and the specular map. Now all the pieces of sheet metal should have their own bolts. I could have made them a little bit bigger so they stood out more, but I kept them small. Now I'm going to go through and I'm going to randomize it by pressing the L key over each island of UVs to select a single island of UVs or a single group of UVs from each piece of sheet metal. I'm just going to move them down the line, make sure they all have their own unique space. I just went through and selected a bunch of random UV islands, rotated them 180 degrees just to make more variation in the textures. I'm going to go and reopen plankscol.psd. I wasn't really happy with my plank textures. Go into the wood, planks, and beams folder. I'm going to select pole 3, pole 2, beams 1, beams 2. I'm going to open them up. I end up using beams 1 and beams 2 and taking a bunch of samples from them and using them as plank textures. So just like we did before, I'm just going to go through, take some samples, fix it up with the clone tool. Trim it, offset it, fix the scene, blah blah blah. I think I'm going to create 3 samples here instead of 4, so we're going to have to fix some of the UVs. I join them together and shrink them into space. I'm going to move the texture that I used for the pillars and up across the new planks that I created. I'm going to change it to blending mode soft light. And change the fill to about 50%. Actually, I put it down to about 30%. I'm going to go through, offset it, and fix the seam. I'm selecting this space in between each of the planks. I filled it with a light yellow color. I went and used a Gaussian blur filter. I'm going to try and lighten up the edges as if they were worn away and it was dirty in the center. This usually adds a really nice effect on wood objects. It's normally a technique used for a more stylized game with stylized textures. There is a lot of wood in real life that displays the same characteristic or trait, that it would lighten up on the edges because it's worn away there. I don't think I end up keeping that, but here I am trying to load it in the blender and get a nice visualization, see how it looks. Of course, I still have to fix the UVs. Right now I'm just getting an idea of how the coloring looks. I give it a tiny bit more of a red tint. I darken it just a little bit. I'm selecting the middle plank and I'm changing the levels and the saturation on that a little bit just to make it look unique from the others. And the top one I'm darkening a little bit. I'm going to save that, load it in Blender, and see how it looks. It's looking a lot better. I can see some variation, but it's not too much variation that makes it look bad. I'm going to select this whole bottom line of UVs. And I'm going to move it down. I'm going to select the next line and move it down. And then I'm going to rearrange everything. Since we have 4 strips, that was for the original 4 planks on the original texture, we have to kind of reorganize things so that it all fits within the 3 strips that we just created. Since our texture now only has 3 samples of plank wood. I should have stuck to the original plan and just created an even 4 strips, 4 samples of plank wood, because that's what I originally had there. That way I wouldn't have to have reorganized all the UVs like this. But in only using 3 samples of wood, I got to use more texture space for each sample, which allows them to be a little bit more detailed. Now I'm just selecting the bottom of all these UVs and making sure they don't overlap into the second sample of wood. I don't know why everything was overlapping so much. That was just a mistake I made earlier on. I'm just going to get a quick preview before I fix the rest of the UVs. You can see the light edges on the planks, and it looks okay, but I end up either deleting that or making it a lot less noticeable. Just making sure there's no overlap by moving this entire set of UVs to the left, locked to the x-axis, and seeing if anything overlaps to another plank. Now I'm fixing the UVs for the rest of the planks as well. Since there's not as many faces with the rest of the planks, it's going to be a lot easier and it's going to go a lot quicker. And none of these UVs were screwed up or overlapping like they were with the trusses. So if you do things right the first time, you save yourself some time. Each object that I finish fixing, I make sure I hide it, just to get it out of my way so it doesn't obstruct my view, and to let me know how far along I am in finishing it. I open back up the roof ply col PNG image. I'm going to add a little extra detail there by going to the stone cement folder and opening up cement 2. I'm going to copy and paste that on top of the plywood. I'm going to stretch it to fit. I'm going to trim it. Get rid of the unique details. Offset it. I'm going to fix the seams, top and bottom. I'm also making sure that the luminosity in each area of the image is similar. You don't want a dark section at the top and a light section at the bottom. That's going to make tiling look absolutely terrible. I'm messing with the blending modes. I'll probably end up with either multiply or soft light again. I put it on multiply and messed with the levels. I'm going to open up the wood sheets folder. I'm going to bring another wood sample in called plywood1.jpg. I just want some extra wood grain on this image, so I'm going to paste that on top, duplicate the layer, and then fix the seam in between. I'm going to add some contrast by changing the levels. Got it on hard light, and I'm going to desaturate it quite a bit. I'm going to change the fill percent to about 48%. Now it's starting to look real dirty and real nice. Getting rid of that dark patch up there, that wouldn't look good tiled. I saved that PSD, and now I'm going to save this color map. Open up the final plankscal.png image, and I changed the hue to give it a little bit more red of a tint. And I save that. I usually only work with final images if I know I'm 100% complete with them. Otherwise, it just creates more work for myself if I've got to go back into the PSD and make the changes that I made to the PNG. So covered in this section, we're going to place nails in all the planks. We're going to create window textures. We're going to sculpt the ground for a normal map, and we're going to create ground textures, and we're going to apply them to a scene using a technique called splatting. Now here I'm creating a stupid little nail. It's just going to be a few vertices and a few faces, and I'm basically going to put real nails into every single plank. This originally was for the purpose of for when I'm baking AO maps and shadow maps, that these little nails would actually cast shadows onto the objects, so that they would appear on the AO map when we applied it to the object. But I end up actually keeping them in the scene. It didn't have the desired result that I wanted. In order for the shadows of these tiny nails to appear on the AO maps and the shadow maps, I would have had to have rendered the AO maps at a much higher resolution than I do. And you can do that if you choose to. I just end up keeping these in the scene. It just adds a little bit of extra detail. They don't look that great, but it's something. The idea was just to have their shadows on the texture maps, and that way it looks like there's nails there, but I end up just keeping them there. Now in the 3D view header, I enabled that magnet icon, and in the menu next to that, I enabled face, so that we can place these objects on faces. And in the menu next to that, I end up choosing center, so that we can use the center point of our nails to place these. And next to that menu, there's a little sphere icon with something pointing out of it. That aligns these objects to all the individual faces upon which you place them. So if you place this nail on top of a 45-degree angle face, then the nail itself is going to rotate 45 degrees as well to match it. Now I selected a window, went into local view, and we're going to create a texture map for the window now. The window is going to have its own texture. It's not going to be sharing material or textures with anything else, but we are going to steal the textures samples from the wood plank texture. So I pulled in the pillar texture and the white plank texture. I'm going to get rid of these lines in the white plank texture, and what we're going to do is kind of make this texture appear as if there's chipped paint on top of wood. But first I'm going to get rid of all these lines in the white planks, so that just looks like one sheet of wood. And then the pillar texture, I'm going to duplicate that, desaturate it, and adjust the levels so they're really extreme. And all of the white areas are where the chipped wood is going to be. Where the chipped paint is going to be on top of the wood. Now in the Channels tab, this little circle at the bottom, I click on that and it selects all the white area. And then with the white paint layer selected, I inverse the selection and press delete, and it leaves me with a lot of chipped paint. I have it cast a little bit of a shadow with a layer style, just so it pops a little bit more. I navigate to the Building Windows folder and open up that texture or that photo. I'm going to take a few samples from here and place them in our window texture. I brought 3 in, and I'm going to join them together into one layer and shrink them down to fit in the texture space. I'm going to snag 3 more and do the same thing so that we can have 6 individual panes for the window. I'm going to save that as windowcol.psd. I'm going to save a PNG of it too so we can pull it into Blender and see how it looks. And we also have to reorganize our UVs for the window. And it looks pretty good. I'm fixing up the UVs because there's a little bit of stretching that becomes noticeable since we added the extra detail of the chipped paint. Now I make the background layer invisible, and in the Channels tab I select that circle tool thing again, with that circle icon, to select all the white areas. And I press the delete key once on the window layer. I made a backup of that layer, by the way, just so in case I screw up. So after pressing the delete key once, it gave me now an alpha texture. And I reload this into Blender, and we're going to create an actual alpha texture map for this. But for now, to quickly visualize it, I have the alpha data in the color map. So I'm going to create a new material called Windows, intensity up to 1, intensity for diffuse up to 1. Create a new texture and rename that Window Col. Change it to image type. Load the Window Col image into that. Change the coordinates to UV. Make sure your shading mode is in GLSL and the display options in the side panel. I have crappy lighting in the scene right now. I just want to make sure that everything is displaying correctly, that all the textures and materials are displaying correctly. We're going to work on lighting in a different chapter. In the transparency panel in the material settings, turn alpha down to 0. The whole window is invisible right now. We're going to fix that in the texture settings. Scroll down to the influence panel and enable alpha. You might need to rotate the view. GLSL is kind of weird and fidgety like that. For things to update, you might need to either update the material or update the view by just simply rotating it so that it redraws. So our amount of alpha looks pretty good. Now the biggest problem with having alpha data in your color map is that it usually creates some sort of border around your alpha details in real time. So if you had a color map with alpha data of something like a leaf, for example, and you map that onto a plane, there's a good chance you'll see some sort of border around it, usually white and very noticeable, especially with MIP mapping turned on. So a way to get around that is to actually use alpha maps. When I don't need it to visualize things, I turn alpha off on materials, because at least for the time being, if you have alpha turned on and you're rotating the scene in GLSL mode, everything kind of flickers and blinks, and it gets really annoying after a while. So when I'm not using or visualizing things with alpha turned on, I turn it off. So now I got a new file started up. Created a plane. I'm going to subdivide it 5 or 6 times. Now what we're going to do is sculpt this plane into a nice general normal map to use for our ground mesh. In sculpt mode right now, I'm just playing with the brushes. I crank the distance up because I just want a bunch of bumps. This is going to be a very general normal map. So I'm just creating a bunch of bumps by just stroking everywhere and every inch of this plane until I get a nice bumpy texture. I have it locked on the z-axis so that it doesn't go outside the bounds of this plane. It only raises and lowers things on the z-axis. And now I'm going through with different size brushes to create different kinds of bumps. I change to the smooth brush. Just to smooth things out. We don't want too much detail. To center the cursor back to the origin of 0, 0, 0, I press Shift plus C, which basically centers everything in the scene, and it repositions the cursor to the center. That's how I added a new plane directly on top of the old plane. Now we're going to bake the normal map from the high poly plane we just sculpted onto this single face plane, which I end up having to subdivide at least once, because for some reason Blender wouldn't bake the normal map onto a plane that only had one quad. So I added a new image, and I applied that image to the UVs of the new plane. I selected the high poly plane. I held Shift and selected the low poly plane. Now in the Bake menu in the Render window, I chose Bake Mode Normals, Normal Space Tangent, and I enabled Selected to Active, and I pressed the Bake button. But this was my output. This is simply because there's only 2 triangles on this plane. When I subdivide it, everything ends up working well. I also end up having to press Set Smooth on this plane too, else you get a bit of a seam in your normal map that gets baked. Takes me a second to figure out why. At first I thought it was a positioning thing. Then I forgot that you actually have to have a few faces on a plane that you bake to. So I just subdivided that 3 times, and now it's going to work. So I select the high poly plane, and I hold Shift and select the low poly plane, and press Bake, and there we have it. You can see a couple of seams. That's because I didn't set smooth the low poly plane yet. That's what I'm zooming in to look at right now, wondering why the hell that happened. Blender's definitely finicky like that. I don't even think you're supposed to have to subdivide the plane in order for this to work, but you learn many, many workarounds after many years of using this program. So here I was just double checking if that was indeed the problem, that it wasn't subdivided. It was, so I subdivided again. I bake it again, but I end up with seams again. because I didn't set smooth it yet. So there I went into the side panel, pressed set smooth on the low poly plane, baked it again, and we're finished. I'm going to save that image as ground nor.png. That's just going to be a general normal map for the entire ground. I'm going to open that up. I'm going to fix a few areas here and there with the clone brush. I'm also going to make sure that it's seamless. In the ground folder, I'm going to open dirt4.png, graydirt.png. I'm going to open them two up. Now I'm going to go through, I'm going to mix these two together and try and get a decent ground texture. Same way as before, no new techniques. Just fixing a bunch of seams, fixing a bunch of details with the clone brush, using different blending modes, playing with saturation, and playing with levels. Those are basically the only tools I ever use in Photoshop. A few filters here and there for sharpen, maybe a little blur. I'm going to save that as ground dirt cal.png. I'm going to go through and save normal map for it and a specular map. This was the specular map. Now we're going to find a few photos to use to create a grass texture. I selected dirt smallplants.jpg and grass dirt 1 and that DSCN 2007. And also dirt small grass. I missed that one. I end up using dirt smallplants.jpg, going through with the clone brush, getting rid of all the details like twigs, cigarettes, lighters, whatever the hell's on the ground. I'm going to crop the image to a nice square chunk of it. I'm going to change the image size to 1024 by 1024. I'm going to get rid of those nasty seams. I duplicated the layer and I blurred it a bit, just so that I can mix that on top of itself using the soft light blending mode, just for a little extra detail, a little extra color. Also adds a bit of style to it, kind of like it's glowing just a tiny bit. I end up deleting it though and just changing the levels to achieve the kind of look I'm going for. I just want a little bit more contrast. Then I applied a sharpen filter. I usually apply sharpen filters to a duplicated layer so that I can change the opacity of that layer in case things end up a little bit too sharp. Then we're going to create the specular map and the normal map. There I'm creating two layers of the normal map again, one sharp layer and one more blurred layer to create more volume in the normal map. Or more of an idea of volume anyway. I added a new material to the ground called ground. I'm going to add a new texture. We're about to begin splatting. So I'm going to name the first texture ground dirt col. Change it to image type, and I'm going to load in the dirt texture, which we do end up changing later on to more of a cracked earth dirt. Now with all the vertices of the ground mesh selected, I'm going to press the U key and project from view from the top view. I'm going to scale this over the dirt. So the ground unwrapped from top view, I just scaled it onto the dirt just to get a visualization and see what it looks like in the environment. For that ground dirt texture, change the UV coordinates or the coordinates to UV. And I'm going to go and change the UV layer name to color, just like we did for every other object earlier. I'm going to crank the specularity down to 0, and back in the texture panel, I'm going to select the third slot. I'm going to change that texture type to image and rename it to ground grass col. and we're going to load in the grass texture for that slot. In between these, we're going to create a stencil map, and that's how we're going to splat textures, by using something called a stencil map. We're going to change the coordinates to UV, the layer to color, and that's important. When you change the coordinates to UV, make sure that you change the UV layer for that texture to color as well. We end up going over all the objects later and changing their layer names in each individual texture to color or AO, depending on what layer type we're using for whatever texture. You can also use the size coordinates in the texture channel, or in texture buttons in the mapping panel, to change how the texture is displayed on the object. That also works with GLSL and real-time. So I just cranked that grass texture up to 2x and 2y. Still think it's a little bit big. So I crank X up to 2.5 and Y up to 2.5. Rotate the image, watch it update, and that looks a lot better. So splatting is something that helps us get rid of all that tiling that you see there. We can splat dirt over that now to create pathways, which adds more detail to the ground, and it hides all that tiling. I crank the size up to 2.75 each, just to make it a little bit smaller. So now that middle texture slot, we're going to create a stencil map. First, we're going to create a new UV layer called stencil by pressing the plus sign on the side of that UV texture panel. And in top view, select project from view by pressing the U key. Create a new image, 1024 by 1024, and scale these UVs up, and then stretch them wide to fill the whole UV area. In the image menu, press Save As, go to the Textures folder, and rename this ground stencil.png. Make sure you change the file type to PNG on the side there. The most important part to remember is that you have to save this image. When we start painting on this image, you make sure that you save this image when you're finished painting, or when you update it at all, because Blender does not save that automatically. So if you were to close your blend file and open it back up, you would lose all that data. So in that middle texture slot, I'm going to rename it to ground stencil. I'm going to change the type to image or movie, and we're going to load in that ground stencil.png image we just created. I'm going to scroll to the bottom to the influence panel. I'm going to deselect color, enable stencil, and RGB to intensity. The color here doesn't matter. I'm just sick of looking at pink. Change the coordinates to UV and change the UV layer to stencil. That way it uses the UV data from that new UV layer we created. Now I was trying to figure out why the dirt map wasn't displaying. So I turned on and off negative in the stencil map, but that wasn't it. I realized that I have to go back to the ground dirt col texture and change the coordinate layer to color instead of UV text, since we changed the name of that UV layer. And that fixed it. Now I rearrange the layers. I put the grass up top and the dirt beneath the stencil map. Now before we begin texture splatting, make sure that all of your UVs are applied to the stencil map image we just created. I'm going to hide all of the puddles, just for now, just so they're not obstructing our view. Now with the ground selector, we're going to go up into the mode menu and change it to texture paint. We're going to bring the toolbar back on the left with our paint options. You can press the F key to change the size of the brush. Now I'm going to change the strength of the brush to about 0.6. That way we can accumulate dirt instead of painting it on at 100%. Now most of the environment is going to be dirt, but we're going to leave grass in some areas, like around the pillars and in the corners. Now I'm just going to go through and create a beaten path all around the environment, leaving some grass here and there. So you can see what our stencil map looks like on the right there. I'm not finished. I ended up fixating this a few more times throughout the project, redoing things that I think look bad. When you start adding objects to the scene, you can also get a better idea of how it all looks complete. Changing the size of the dirt texture, because I thought that was a little bit too big, so I changed it to 1.3 by 1.3. I made sure I saved my stencil map image so I don't lose all that data. So now we have nice little paths. Covered in this section, we're going to add materials. We're going to sculpt a normal map for the walls. We're going to finish the remaining normal maps and specular maps for all the textures, and we're going to create alpha maps for the windows. The ground selected, I'm going to go into a new texture channel underneath ground dirt col. I'm going to rename that ground nor and change it to type image. Actually, I'm going to rename that to ground dirt nor. We're going to load in the normal map for the dirt. And navigate to the textures folder and load in ground dirt nor. Change the coordinates to UV and the UV layer to color. Change normal map type to tangent and enable normal map. Change the size to 1.3 by 1.3 on the X and Y, just because we scaled the dirt color map earlier. Now disable color and enable normal in the influence panel. Now I'm just rotating the light to get a better visualization of the normal map on the ground, just to make sure that it's working, and it is. Now in a new channel beneath that, create a new texture called ground dirt spec, and load in the ground dirt specular map. Coordinates to UV, layer name to color, size 1.3 by 1.3. Disable color and enable color on specular and intensity on specular. Here I'm just playing with the settings in the influence panel to get the best results for specularity. I have RGB to intensity enabled. So I end up just keeping intensity and RGB to intensity both enabled. And now I moved all of those texture channels down so I can create two blank channels beneath grass col. I added a new texture there called ground grass nor, and we're going to load in the normal map for the grass. Normal map type, the tangent, size 3 by 3, actually 2.75 by 2.75, because that's the scale that I used for the grass color map. And we're doing the same thing we did with the dirt normal map here. Disable intensity under diffuse in the influence panel, and enable normal under geometry in the influence panel. Now in that last empty slot, create a new texture called ground grass speck. Load in the specular map for the grass, and use the same settings as for the dirt. Again, I changed the size to 2.75 by 2.75 to match the color map size. I'm just enabling and disabling hardness in the influence panel just to see if that affects the specularity in a positive way. I'll add a new channel called ground nor. We're going to load in that ground normal map that we sculpted on a plane, just for an overall waviness to the ground itself. Change coordinates to UV, layer to color, and I have size at the default 1 by 1. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger by scaling down the size to 0.6 by 0.6. Having different size normal maps like this also helps to hide the tiling of your color maps and the tiling of your normal maps as well, because it gives bigger detail to the scene. I made the bumpiness less intense by changing the normal value down to 0.6. And there's our texture stack for the ground. Now we're going to add materials for everything else. I'm first selecting the pillars and creating a material called planks underscore beams. Now in the texture window, I'm adding a texture called plank col. We're going to load in the color map for the planks. Coordinates to UV, UV layer to color. Move the scene so GLSL updates and everything redraws. And on the texture slot beneath that, we're then going to add the normal map and the color map. Normal map and the specular map. And on the fencing planks, I forgot to change the UV layer names to color, so I just went ahead and fixed that. Now I just added a color map to that material for the time being, just so I can apply it to everything in the scene that needs that material. So anything that uses the wood texture from that plank texture map, I'm going to make it use the same material. And there's more planks that I need to change the UV layer name to. Everything that has the same material, I'm now joining together. But make sure before you join them together to make sure that all of their UV layer names are named color. Now I'm selecting the wall. I'm creating a new material called wall. I crank the intensity of the diffuse up to 1. Now I'm adding a new texture called wall col. And we're going to load in the wall color map. Same as everything else, change coordinates to UV, the layer name to color. Here I'm just going to give the wires their own material with a dark gray color and a little bit of specularity. Now I'm just applying materials to all the other objects in the other layers. We're going to create a new material for the roof called roof. Crank diffuse up to 1, specularity down to 0. Add a new texture called roof col. We're going to load in the color map for the roof called roof ply col. And we're going to load that material in for all the loose sheets of plywood on the roof as well. Right now I'm just working with color maps just so I can visualize the whole scene together. Because we're using specular maps for all these objects, you can crank the specularity in the material settings down to 0. The specularity in your material settings adds an additional general specularity to your objects. In addition to the specularity given to you by your specular maps, you'll also have an overall specularity from your material settings. There I was just playing with the texture stack of the ground, moving a normal map up or down, to see how it would affect everything. There I sized the UVs of the ground mesh up so that I didn't have to use the X and Y sizes in the textures. It's really just a matter of organization, I guess. It wasn't really necessary. And there I was just fixing a piece of sheet metal that was intersecting the wall. Now we're going to create a normal map for the wall. And here I'm disabling some layers that won't be necessary in the normal map. Some of these are stains and won't actually provide any bump to the wall itself. So I'm going to hide those layers. I'm going to flatten the image and then desaturate it. I'm going to create a duplicate of that layer. And we're going to do the same thing that we did before with other normal maps. Except I changed the scale there to 16. And that sample was at 7 by 7. But before I do that, I decided that it would be best to actually sculpt a bit of a normal map. So I took that desaturated image and I saved it as ground displace or something like that. So right now we're going to make a displacement map, and we're going to subdivide a plane a bunch of times, apply that displacement map to it, and then do some sculpting to get an actual real normal map from Blender that we can use for our wall. So in a new file I created a plane and I made its width twice the size. I'm splitting the view, and on the right side I'm going to load in the UV image editor. And I'm going to open up that displacement map I just created called wall nor displace. And I'm going to unwrap that plane to it. I'm going to add a new material and a new texture. And in the texture I'm going to load in the image of that displacement map. Change the coordinates to UV. Now here I'm playing with the camera because the original idea was to actually render out a normal map. But we're just going to end up baking it the way we did before, by using a low poly plane and baking a normal map from a high poly object to it. So that's why I was trying to align the camera perfectly to it. I'm going to add a loop cut in the center there just to make all these subdivisions equal. I'm going to subdivide it 6 or 7 times. However many subdivisions your computer can handle, I'd suggest going all out. In the modifier buttons, which is the little wrench, add a modifier called multi-resolution. So we're going to create a multi-res mesh here to create our displaced object and then sculpt on it. So I just added one level. Multi-resolution allows you to create different levels of subdivision, but preview them at lower levels, and also be able to edit the mesh in any of those levels. So to this object I'm going to create another modifier called displace. And in the texture channel I'm going to load in the texture I created with the displacement image. I'm going to change the direction to Z and map to UV for texture coordinates. And you can see our texture that's UV mapped to that plane is making it displaced now. And the more vertices you have on the plane, the more smooth the displacement would be. I changed the strength to 0.3 just because it was a little too extreme. And in the tool panel I'm going to select set smooth for that. Back in the modifier buttons, I'm changing preview to 1 just to see what it looks like at high detail. I'm back in Photoshop. I'm playing with the levels to make the details really stand out, because the more extreme the displacement map is, the more extreme the displacement will be. Now I'm going over it with a very light brush at a low opacity. I'm painting in the center because I don't want there to be too many details there. I don't want a whole lot of displacement in the center of the wall, just in the top and the bottom. I'm going to save that and reload it in Blender and see how it looks. So I loaded the new displacement map into Blender, and you can see that the details have changed. I changed the strength to about 0.1. Now these details are looking pretty good. Now I'm going to add a new plane. I'm going to scale it up twice the width. This is going to be the low poly object that we bake the normal map and the high poly object onto. I'm going to create a new image, 2048 by 1024, and from front view or top view, whatever that was, I projected from view to bounds, so that I extended the whole bounds of the UV layout. And I selected the high poly object, held shift, and then selected the low poly object. Changed the bake mode to normals, normal space to tangent, margin to 4, selected to active is enabled. And before I render this, I'm going to save it in the resources folder, just in case baking makes Blender crash, which it does occasionally. So this file is saved as wall normal, and I'm going to bake. Now this normal map came out a lot better than if we were to just simply convert it in Photoshop. We're also going to convert it though, and we're going to overlay those converted layers. Here I'm just trimming the high poly mesh. I want to add some more detail to this normal map for baking, so I'm getting rid of all the excess vertices around it so that my computer can handle more detail. So I'm going to go back into the multi-res modifier, and I'm going to subdivide it one level higher. Now we have lots of super fine detail. I'm going to save that before baking it again. I'm going to save that in the textures folder as wall.nor.png. I'm back in Photoshop. I'm opening up wall.nor.psd and the normal map we just created in Blender. I'm going to offset that by 1024 just to see if there's a seam. There's not, so I undid that. Now I'm going to go back to all these layers and again disable the ones that I don't want to bump out. I'm going to join them all together, desaturate it, duplicate the layer, and create two different conversions, one at 7x7 at scale 16. I'm going to invert that red channel, and then the next conversion will be at 3x3, no, will be at 4 and scale 10 for very fine detail. And I'm going to blend that with soft light instead of overlay. They're pretty similar, but sometimes I choose soft light because it has a better look to it. So I blend them together. And now I'm pasting the Blender normal map on top of them. And here I'm just taking a sample of the color, adding a new layer, and putting that fill opacity at 60%, just so I can drown out the details beneath it. So here I just have 3 different normal map layers, one from Blender and 2 from Photoshop, and I'm playing with the opacity of everything, and I'm drowning out some of the details in the center because I don't want there to be too much bump there. That's actually a smooth part of the wall. It's the top and bottom that are really crumbling. So here I'm just painting over the top layer, the center of the top layer, with a big brush with a blue color to drown out those details. And I save that, and now I'm going to save this as a PNG in the textures folder as wall.nor. I forgot to invert one of those red channels, so that's what I just did right there. I'm going to open up the warehouse again. We're going to load this normal map onto the walls. So create a normal map just like we've been doing. New texture called wall nor. Load in the image. Coordinates to UV. Layer to color. Enable normal map. Change the type to tangent. Disable color in the influence panel. And enable normal in the geometry. So there you can see our normal map. And once we add specularity and decent lighting, it's really going to stand out. Now I'm opening up wall col again. We're going to create a specularity map now. I'm going to save that PSD as wall spec. I'm going to desaturate every layer. Now when creating the specularity map, we want to keep every layer, especially the stains, because that's what affects specularity. And on some of the layers we're going to darken, some of the layers we're going to change the fill opacity. And I join them all together. I'm going to play with the normals. I'm going to save that as wallspec.png, and I'm going to load that in as a texture. We're going to use the same settings that we've been using for specularity. First we're going to load in the spec map. We're going to change coordinates to UV, the layer to color. We're going to disable color under diffuse in the influence panel. And enable intensity and RGB to intensity. It's a little bright now, but we'll be changing the settings of these later. When we add AO and shadow maps, it's actually we're actually going to combine them into one map. So when we add let's call them light maps. When we add a light map, that's going to affect the specularity. So that takes care of the wall textures for now. Now open up the planks.col.psd file, and we're going to create normal maps and specularity maps for this as well. Same techniques as before. For a normal map, hide layers that you don't want to cause bumpiness. Play with the levels. Do a little painting here and there to drown out details that you don't want bumped out. And here I'm going to modify all the layers, and then I'm going to join them together and create conversions, normal map conversions. And we're going to make conversions just the same as before. I'm going to make two different layers with two different conversion types, one at 7x7 and one at 4. Mix them together with either overlay or soft light, and change the opacity as needed. Especially on planks of wood, you don't want the normal value to be too extreme. But normal values can also always be changed within Blender itself in the texture menu. In the texture buttons. So we have our normal map, and now we're going to make a specularity map. And then we're going to load these textures into the material, just the same as before with the wall. And we're going to continue on to other textures, creating normal maps and specularity maps. And we're going to repeat the process until our entire environment is textured. Now we're working with the windows. We're going to create a normal map in the same way. And after we finish the normal map and specularity map, we're going to create an alpha map. Remember to invert those red channels if you convert normal maps in Photoshop. There I was just making the normal map details a little less extreme. So with window callback open, we're now going to create the alpha map for the window. Any area on an alpha map that is white is opaque. Any area that is black is transparent. I mean, you can invert that in Blender, but that's just generally the way you should go about creating an alpha map. So the actual window panes, I inverted those colors so that the stains were white, because the stains are what's going to show up, where the window itself is actually going to be a darker color. Some areas will be black so that it's completely transparent. I'm just going to preview this real fast by saving it as window-alpha.png to see if these windows are dark enough and transparent enough. Now if you see, I took a sample of the coloring from the alpha map and I put down that color in the background of the color map. That's so if we were to have a white color in the background of the windows in the color map, there would be a white outline around all the stains, which would appear very ugly. So if you have a gray color or a color closer to the stains on the window, then the outline is going to be that color and it's going to blend in a lot better. So now I took the alpha, I disabled alpha on the color map of the window, and we're now going to add a new texture, an empty texture slot called window alpha. And we're going to load in the window alpha image. I'm going to disable color and enable alpha. Change coordinates to UV, layer to color. And in the material settings, in the transparency panel, we're going to enable transparency with alpha down to 0. And as you can see, the stains have a gray outline, which is exactly what we wanted. If we would have left the background color as white, the stains would have had a white outline. And if we would have made the background color green, it would have had a green outline, and so on. Right now I just selected the roof because the specularity was a bit high, so I cranked it down to 0.4. And then 0.3. Covered in this section, we're going to create a puddle material, including using a color ramp to create a sort of Fresnel effect, and we're going to make some fixes to the splatting we did to the ground. I'll create a new image at 1024 by 1024 in Photoshop. I'll create a new image at 512 by 512. Go into the TextLib folder, and in the ground folder, actually we're going to go into the metal flat folder and select Dirty Metal 1. This will be the base texture for all of our grime and our puddles. So I trimmed the border of that, and I'm going to go through and get rid of some of the details, since this is going to be tiling. Offset it, I'm going to fix the seams. Same old crap. Offset it vertically too, because this is going to be tiling in all directions. I'm going to desaturate that almost all the way, but not entirely. Leave a little bit of blue color. I'm going to save that as water col. I'm going to play with those levels. I'm going to save that as water spec. That's our specularity map. Now I'm going to create a normal map for it. It wasn't an extreme normal map. I think I had scaled down to maybe 3 or 4. So I save that as the normal map. I played with the levels and I inverted the colors because now we're creating an alpha map. We want this to be mainly gray, but the areas that are white in this map are is like the scum and the dirt floating on top, so we want them to be more opaque. So I save that as the alpha map. Now we're going to select the puddles, and we're going to create a new material and add textures to them just like we did for the windows, including the alpha map. In top view and in edit mode with all the vertices selected, we're going to load in the watercolor image and project from view all of those UVs, stretch them up until we have a good scale for the texture. I'm going to change the material color to white, although it's not really necessary. Change specularity to 0 and diffuse to 1. Now we're going to add the texture stack. First texture is watercolor. Same steps as every other texture. Coordinates UV, layer to whatever the layer name was. In this case it's UV text. I'm only going to need one UV layer for the puddles because I'm not adding AO maps to them. So that's why I didn't change the UV layer name to color, because I only need one, so it's not necessary. Now we're going to load in the normal map, change coordinates to UV. We don't even have to change the layer there, but I'm going to anyway, to UV text. Enable normal map in tangent space. Enable normal in geometry and disable color. Here I went to an empty texture slot. I'm going to change the texture name to water spec. I'm going to load in the specularity map for the water. Coordinates to UV, layer to UV text. Doesn't matter with the water since there's only one UV layer. Same story. Enable RGB to intensity and intensity. You can even enable hardness if you want. Hardness just uses data from the image that you're using in order to calculate how hard or soft the specularity point will be. And now in a new texture channel, load in window alpha. I disable use alpha there, but I don't think it's necessary to do. Change mapping coordinates to UV, UV layer to UV text. Disable color. Enable alpha. And in the material settings, change alpha down to 0 and enable transparency. Our water is looking a bit illuminated, a little too white. It's not really fitting into the scene, but we're going to fix that. We're going to change the color to a bit more of a brown, and then we're going to add a color map to kind of add a Fresnel effect, so when you're looking at it at more of an extreme angle, it's going to be darker, and when you're looking at it from, say, a top view, it's going to be more transparent. But we have a start. I'm going to open up watercolor image. I'm going to select a brown color, add a new layer, paint over the top of it, change the blending type to multiply, and then change the fill percent to about 60. I'm going to reload that into Blender. Now it's blending in a little bit too well. I'm going to open up the water alpha image And I'm going to change the levels so that's a little bit brighter. I'm going to change the alpha value to 0.2 in the material settings so that overall it's more visible. I'm going to desaturate the color a little bit. It was a little too brown. I'm going to change transparency to 0.35. And here it's just a lot of tweaking. Now on these other puddles I noticed that the normal map wasn't working on them for some odd reason. So I'm just trying to figure out why the heck that would be happening. Why on one puddle within the same mesh the normal map would be appearing correctly, but not on any other puddle. That's all in the same mesh with the same material and the same textures. Blender's really weird like that. To fix it, I end up deleting all the problem puddles and just duplicating the one puddle that works and moving it around the mesh. Really lame, and I don't know what kind of bug this was, but luckily it was an easy fix as soon as I figured out what to do. So now I took the puddles and the lights into the local view. I took the lights too, just so that everything wasn't black. So now I'm just going to take the one puddle that actually has a normal map displaying correctly, and I'm going to replace those other puddles that are very flat shaded and don't have the normal map. First I tried flipping normals to see if that worked, but to no avail. So now I'm duplicating the one puddle that works. I'm going to size it down and position it directly over the puddles that did not work, and I'm going to delete those puddles that didn't work, and that's that. Also make sure that you scale the UVs to suit the new scale of the puddle that you just duplicated. And that appears to be working. So we found a solution. It's a stupid one. Should not be necessary, but it's Blender. You gotta learn how to deal with crap like this. Now all of the puddles are working. I turn the water specularity down to about 0.65. And I'm turning the normal value down to about 0.4. Just because it's not a very turbulent puddle. The normal map is basically just showing that there's a bit of grime and dirt floating on top. Now in the material settings, we're going to create a ramp. So in the diffuse panel, enable the ramp setting. Slide the line on the right there all the way to the left. And kind of switch those two up. And make the line on the left a nice brown color at an alpha value of about 0.6. Change the input type to normal. So we have two lines in the color ramp. The line on the right is at a white color and alpha of 0. The line on the left is at a brown color and alpha to 1. I just changed it to 1 just to preview this. And input type to normal. You can see when you view these puddles at an extreme angle, like closer to the ground, they're a lot darker and a lot more visible. Whereas if you look at them from top view, they appear more transparent. Actually, the line on the right was a color of black, not white. And here I just wanted to change the size of the textures on the ground. I actually deleted the ground grass nor texture because I figured that the other two normal maps that we have were plenty and there was no need to waste more resources on a third normal map for the ground. I'm going to go through, I'm going to fix some of the splatting. Seems a bit too chaotic, so I'm going to create more grass around the pillars and around the edges and the walls. And I'm going to create a more defined path by putting down some more dirt. Don't forget to save any of the changes you make to the stencil map. Again, I'm just playing with sizes of the ground textures.